Happy New Year, everyone. It's January, and January is also Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So it's very appropriate that we should have Rose Mukhar, of the founder and executive director, CEO of Justice at Last. Rose is a social justice, human rights, and crime victims' rights attorney with experience in cases involving children, women, refugees, and survivors of domestic violence, torture, and human trafficking. She has a LLM in International Legal Studies with a focus on human rights and her JD. When she had her private practice in San Francisco after completing her degrees, she did a lot of pro bono work and found that the human rights or the human trafficking area had many survivors, and there wasn't very many services available for them. So she founded Justice at Last, which provides free legal representation to survivors. It's client-centered, trauma-informed, and culturally sensitive. Their work is guided by the principles of human rights, including participation, accountability, non-discrimination, and equality, empowerment, and legality. There are many attorneys and human rights advocates collectively have decades of experience providing support services and advocating for the rights of survivors of trafficking. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Rose Mukhar.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm grateful and honored to be here today, and thank you all for showing up and wanting to learn more about human trafficking. As Nancy shared, it is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So let's get started. And I'm slated to go till around 12:30. There's a portion in the training to talk about any questions that might pop up. But as Anne previously shared, if there's something urgent, please just put something in the chat and we can address it as we go forward. I'm just going to quickly go over this. You'll all get a copy of the training itself. And first, I just want to talk about what it is that we do, what Justice at Last does. So we are a legal non-service, we're a nonprofit legal service provider, and we serve the entire Bay Area. We're actually in 15 counties serving the Bay. And we are a mobile practice on purpose, like intentionally, because we know that survivors of trafficking have so many issues that they're going through once they're no longer trafficked. And it might feel intimidating to show up at a law firm setting. So we make every effort to meet the client where they're at. We go to either where the referral came from and meet at a service provider, maybe like the YWCA or a shelter or a safe house. And we meet the client so they don't also have to deal with expenses to travel to go to the law firm, babysitting, whatever cost there might be involved. So we're out and about in the community intentionally. This is the team that we have. It's not all of the staff that we have currently. We're a team of 18 right now. We're made up of attorneys and advocates, and we work in tandem with one another. So our attorneys are doing the legal needs, whatever the client might have. And then the advocates are helping with crisis management, case management, any type of stabilization that a survivor might need. Quite often you'll read in the news, like 20 survivors of human trafficking were just rescued. But what does that really mean? Just because they're no longer in that trafficking situation, are they no longer vulnerable? They most likely are. They probably need housing. They probably need all type of public assistance. And so that's what our case managers and our client advocates do. So we're out and about doing the legal work, but this picture here is made up of our advisors. Justice at Last has advisors that are subject matter experts with lived experience, and they're the ones that we deem are the real experts doing the work. And I'll just highlight for you, some of you might already know Emily Sims. She is one of the founders of the Marin Coalition Against Human Trafficking, which I understand the Women League of Marin County is actually a member of. So Emily was a co-founder of the organization and is still an ongoing advisor of Justice at Last. So let's just start off with what is human trafficking. And this is just going to be a quick summary. I'm not going to go into too much detail, just to give you a sense. You might already be familiar. But we're looking at human trafficking from a global perspective, then we'll look at the US and California. And here are some facts about what we do know. It's hard to actually give accurate numbers about how much human trafficking is going on in the world. So every number that you might see referenced, keep in mind that it is an estimate. There's no way to actually track it. It's illicit activity. And so we don't actually know the exact numbers. So the International Labor Organization estimates it's about $150 billion a year global industry. That's trafficking humans, whether sex or labor trafficking. The Freedom Network USA actually estimates that about 80% of the cases of 25 million people are labor trafficked, and about 20% of the 25 million people estimate of being trafficked around the world are sex trafficked. So we know that labor trafficking is by far more prevalent. However, sex sells. So what you continuously see in the news, and what's usually often most funded, is services for survivors of sex trafficking or children that might be sex trafficked. But we do know, not just at a global level, but at a state level here in the Bay Area, labor trafficking is by far more prevalent for minors and adults. And there's some other items that are listed over here on the left-hand side, the 3 top locations for human trafficking: United States, Central America, and then East Asia. And then there's another form of trafficking that doesn't get a lot of social media attention. That's primarily because it hasn't actually occurred officially in the United States, and that's organ harvesting. It does occur. It primarily occurs globally in Asia. However, there have been cases reported by social service providers here in the state of California, but no formal law enforcement investigations have taken place to date, so there's no actual criminal prosecutions. But unfortunately, I suspect that might occur going on in the future. So what does human trafficking look like here in the United States? These are some data reports that are pulled at a federal level from the United States Trafficking in Persons Report. And at first blush, you might say, well, what do these mean? It says 72% of child trafficking victims who received eligibility letters from the Department of Health and Human Services were labor trafficked. So what that is individuals that are applying for public assistance at a county level. This information gets reported to the state, and then it gets reported over to the federal level. Those individuals that are getting support services for children, 72% of those requests of trafficking were actually children that were being labor trafficked. And then 66% of traffic victims, and this includes adults and minors, were served by the Department of Justice grantees were US citizens. So does that mean that, oh, well, then more US citizens are getting trafficked here in the United States than foreign nationals? I would say keep in mind what the data point is telling us. It's those individuals are getting access to support services. The majority of foreign nationals who are here that are being trafficked likely don't know what their rights are, likely don't even have the opportunity to get access to benefits. So even though we see this number of 66%, it doesn't necessarily mean that the majority of individuals in the United States that are trafficked are US citizens. For Justice at Last, we do have clients that are US citizens that get trafficked, but the majority of our clients are foreign nationals. And then what we also do know about here in the United States is that there are far more labor trafficking cases. However, they're just not being investigated and prosecuted. That's it's great that at least at the federal level, we're recognizing that gap, and the goal is to build on that. So let's look at California. Here's some data points that you might say, well, this looks really old. 2017 is data that I'm referencing here. So that's true, but we actually don't have any other current data points to reference. So I would say that based on 2017, pre-pandemic, these numbers are actually significantly higher now than what you're seeing here that were reported in 2017. And back in 2017, Covenant House did a study of homeless youth, and they determined that 1 out of 5 had actually been trafficked. And then within that trafficking, 81% identified as there being some aspect of forced criminality. So they were forced to sell drugs, or do something along the drug trade. And to a perspective from law enforcement, that individual youth might be deemed as criminal activity. But if you scrape beneath the surface, you find out more information, those individuals are homeless, they had no alternative, and or they were being forced to sell drugs. So that's just some quick data points about human trafficking. Here's some common misconceptions that we see that come up all the time. Traffickers are members of criminal organizations, and that can be true. However, traffickers can be anybody. It could be a small business owner, maybe there's 2 or 3 owners and it's a dry cleaner, or a nail salon, or it could be parents that are trafficking their children. So just because there is criminal activity and organizations and gangs that are doing trafficking, that's not the only individuals that are doing human trafficking. And another common myth of trafficking is that it's all by kidnapping. Foreign nationals are entering the United States and they're kidnapping our US citizen white children. And the reality is the majority of individuals, victims, know their trafficker. Maybe they don't know them personally. Maybe it's a friend of the family. Maybe it's somebody they go to church with. It's somebody who feels safe. And that's what leads to that vulnerability of being trafficked. There are definitely instances where there's kidnapping involved with trafficking, but that is relatively a small number. Again, keep in mind that the majority of victims of human trafficking in some capacity or way know the trafficker. Whoops, sorry about that. Another misconception, that trafficking involves the movement from one country to another. That's actually the definition of smuggling. And when you're smuggling somebody, it's a crime against another country. People are entering a country unlawfully. But human trafficking, you actually don't need any movement. So again, talking about parents could be sex trafficking their own child. The child never leaves the home. Purchasers or buyers are coming to the home to have sex with the child, and this individual is being sex trafficked. There's no movement is required in the definition. And then just generally, if you were to take some time, even right now, and Google human trafficking, these are typical images that are going to pop up. You're going to see primarily victims who are female, who are white. And typically what you'll also see imagery of is bondage, whether it's ropes or chains or shackles. And the reality is the majority of our clients that are trafficked are persons of color. They're definitely women and girls, but also boys and men are trafficked as well. And so we want to also be mindful when we're doing this training is to actually think about these generalizations that we often see with trafficking and the impact of that. Because if we're always focused on the individuals are white young females and the perpetrators are typically persons of color, and there's imagery here of somebody's hand or that's a person of color. What does that mean? What it leads to is racial profiling. It means of over-policing of low-income communities of color. And also means the under-identification of BIPOC survivors of human trafficking. And it's robbing resources within those communities. So something to really be mindful of when you're looking at human trafficking and wanting to get involved and help to stop and prevent human trafficking. Take a look at what it really looks like. These are survivors of human trafficking, and you wouldn't know. You could be standing right next to somebody and they're a survivor of human trafficking. So these are just some data points from Justice at Last that we have. And the majority of the clients that we represent as of now, as of today, 64% of our clients have been labor trafficked, 33% sex trafficked, and then 3% both labor and sex trafficked. And I say this data now with as of today, because if I was presenting to you when the organization was first founded back in 2015, 2016, even up to 2018, the organizations that I was primarily working with were organizations that were serving women. And so the majority of the clients that Justice at Last was seeing were women and girls that had been sex trafficked. However, over the years, as I've learned more and understood more about human trafficking and the prevalence of labor trafficking, and as the trainings continued and working and collaborating with other organizations throughout the Bay Area, our numbers are reflective of slowly we started to see an intake in men and boys who had been trafficked, as well as labor trafficking. So when you're looking again at any data points, always question them and wonder, what does that data actually mean? But this is our data points as of right now. And other things to recognize is 76% of our clients are foreign nationals. They either identify as an immigrant or a refugee. And then I want to be mindful of time since we started a little bit late. We really like to start with what the legal definition of human trafficking is, so you can understand what the conversations are about. And it's really often what we see is people don't necessarily understand the definition. It gets conflated a lot with prostitution. It also gets conflated a lot with smuggling. So we wouldn't just pause for a moment, and we won't go into a lot of detail, but I am an attorney. I do like laws, but I'm going to try to make these broad conversations just so you can understand why it's so important to understand trafficking. And if there's anything to take away from the conversation today, I would ask that you understand the difference between sex trafficking and labor trafficking, and based on our laws. So there's the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, the TVPA, and it defines severe forms of human trafficking in persons. And the California law mimics the federal law. So we start our trainings by looking at the TVPA, and it breaks down human trafficking by sex trafficking and by labor trafficking. It's really important to understand that and to figure out why. So for sex trafficking, you have to be an adult or a minor. And there has to be force, fraud, or coercion that the prosecution will have to show occurred. If they're a minor, the prosecution does not have to show that there was force, fraud, or coercion, only that the act itself occurred. If there's somebody that's labor trafficked, whether they're a minor or an adult, the prosecution will have to show that there's force or fraud or coercion. And so what is the big deal? Why am I calling that out? Because I think it's really important to understand, well, here, before we go back, if you're under 18, you don't have agency. You can't legally consent to having sex. You also can't legally consent to getting a job or entering an employment contract. You have to have parent consent if you're a minor for that. So there's a little bit of a disconnect with the law the way it is. And I apologize, my mouse is flying all over the place. So to understand the trafficking breakdown, you have to look at the action, the means, and the ends. So this is what prosecutors are needing and looking for when they're trying to move forward with a case. Was there recruitment? Was there force, fraud, or coercion? Again, if there's a minor that's sex trafficked, that's not required. And what was the purpose? What was the end of the action? And so what is needed is this force, fraud, and coercion, which most people understand. Force would be the physical beatings. It can also be confining somebody, taking somebody's passport, identification. Or there could be fraud, where there's promises for a job or for a higher education, or coercion, where there's actual threats. So that has to be required for adults that are sex trafficked, or adults or children that are labor trafficked. There has to be an element of either force, fraud, or coercion. And often the reality is there's all three involved. So the other thing I want to talk about with the disconnect in our law is we know that there's no such thing as a child prostitute. There cannot legally be a child who's prostituting themselves, because if you're under the age of 18, you cannot legally consent to sex. And so you are a victim of human trafficking if you're under the age of 18 and law enforcement arrests you for selling sex. But the disconnect is for children, again, and we do see this with children that are labor trafficked, even going back to the data points we talked about earlier. where children are labor trafficked here in the United States. Why are we not prosecuting those cases? Why are we showing or requiring that the youth victim is going to have to be able to provide evidence that they were either forced or there was fraud or coercion? So again, I apologize about the mouse jumping all over the place. Here's just a quick example of a child that was labor trafficked. And Mary is in Peru. She's 15. A family friend offers her to come to the United States, work in a restaurant, and she's told she'll work 4 hours a day after school and earn $10 an hour. But for Mary, the reality is when she arrives, her passport is taken. She's not permitted to leave the house. She's under constant surveillance. She's beaten when she complains, and she ends up being raped and becomes pregnant with the family's friend, of the family friend. There's also fraud. The promises were false. Mary is actually selling magazines door to door. She's not working in the restaurant. And she's working 10 days and an hour on the weekends. And then there's coercion. She's threatened with deportation. There's going to be harm to her family back home. She actually ends up giving birth to the baby, but she's told the child will be taken away from her and she'll be deported if she doesn't continue with the trafficking scheme. So this is not uncommon for what we see for individuals that were labor trafficked. But remember, the law says that the prosecution will only need to show there was force or fraud or coercion, not all three, for labor trafficking of a minor. Here's some industries. It's a list. You can look at it. And I don't know if there's anything that stands out to anybody within the list, but I do know that when I started doing the work, what surprised me the most was the magazine sales, that's often involved. There's labor trafficking involved, not in all instances. And then, well, I think that was probably the main thing that stands out for me. We definitely have seen construction here in the Bay Area. There's been big labor trafficking cases on construction, and also elder care and law, living assisted home. Here's some barriers to victims actually identifying or seeking assistance. The reality is many won't even know what their rights are if they're foreign nationals, or even if they're US citizens, they might not necessarily know. They might not speak the culture, might not understand, or might not speak the language. They don't know or familiar with the culture. Maybe they're coming from a country where you couldn't trust the police, that law enforcement was typically associated with bribes, and so there's a lack of trust of reporting to law enforcement. During the previous Trump administration, there was an extreme fear of identifying oneself as a victim because of the fear of deportation. I think that's pretty much, there's gang involvement. So there's family members who might actually know if they're going to be reporting or identifying what has happened to them. And then what's very common for not just sex trafficking, but also labor trafficking is this trauma bond. And some of you might be familiar with the Stockholm syndrome, but there's quite often, there's a bond that forms between the victim and the trafficker, and they feel that they are part of that person and they can't betray that individual, also based on the coercion that they've received over the course of the trafficking. Once a survivor is identified, there are forms of relief. So what is the incentive for a survivor to come forward? They have legal rights. And that's where Justice at Last steps in, and what we're experts in is providing immigration relief and other forms of legal relief for survivors and victims of human trafficking. These are the top legal needs that we see when we are working with clients. And typically when a survivor of trafficking leaves the trafficking scheme, they have at least 2, if not more, legal needs. And so we meet with them, we let them know what their rights are, and we help them assess and prioritize what they want to focus on and what justice would mean or look like for them. The majority of our clients that we're representing get crime victim rights relief. Many survivors also are forced to commit crimes over the course of their trafficking. So California's got an amazing vacatur law to help clear records. And so that is our number 2 requested legal service. Then there's also immigration relief and family law and other legal services. So I'm going to skip this just based on time. You will get a copy of this training material. And this is just a scenario of a fact pattern of an adult individual. And it's just going through and trying to determine what legal services she might need. I'm happy to email and check in with folks afterwards, but I wanted to just make sure there's time for questions after the training's over. This is another portion of the work that we do. So not only are we providing direct services to survivors of human trafficking, we're also doing training. And the total, since we founded the organization in 2015, we've trained over 9,000 individuals about human trafficking, about the legal forms of relief and the rights of victims. And our training impact continues today. And I think we've had more outreach since the pandemic because the training shifted to virtual. And this is the other section that we're going to, just before we close, talk about our approach to working with survivors and to creating trainings and awareness about human trafficking comes from a human rights-based approach to end human trafficking. And so what does that mean? What does that look like? The approach recognizes the complex and interconnected factors. And I think we really need to stop and take a look at what's historically gone on here in the United States. And we think it's important to look at poverty, racism, misogyny, weak worker protections, that all fuel labor and sex trafficking. And it's really important to understand what a human rights-based approach is. It's recognizing the individual, understanding their agency, respecting it, treating them with dignity, recognizing that the victim will know more than anybody else what's going to be best for them. Our role as attorneys and as a legal provider is to let the individual know what their legal rights are and what outcomes will happen if they decide they want to choose a particular form of relief or not pursue a particular action. So I'm not sure if there was a question. I did hear some background noise. And so that's the human rights-based approach that we come at it. And it's really in opposition to a rescue-based. So we are focused on rights, not rescue. Because we feel that the most effective way to support survivors and to prevent human trafficking is to address public policies that actually underlie injustices and expand survivors' access to services. So that, again, like I mentioned, they're treated with dignity and their agency is recognized. And I think this is where we really want to just pause for a moment. I think many people over the summer may have seen The Sound of Freedom or heard about it, and that might have sparked an interest of wanting to learn more about human trafficking. It's really important to understand that this particular film that's made millions of dollars in the box office is focused on a rescue-based approach, and that the only way to address and combat human trafficking is by rescuing victims. And that is in complete opposition to our approach of the work that we do at Justice at Last. Again, we think it's really important to recognize the individual and the agency of the survivor, and that they are going to know what's the best way for them to exit the trafficking situation. And while some folks might need, law enforcement or other entities to help step in to get them out of that situation, it's really important to see what happens next. If we are rescuing X amount of individuals of human trafficking, where do they go? Do they have housing? Are they going to be provided education to get a job? Are their records going to be cleared so they can apply and get a job? Like looking at the bigger picture. So I'm happy to answer any questions in particular about The Sound of Freedom. I know a lot of folks reached out to me when the film came out. They knew about the organization and wanted to help support our work, but not really understanding the different approaches of what the film focuses on versus the work that we do at Justice at Last. So I'm happy to open it up to any questions there might be at this point, because I know we wanted to allow 15 minutes for questions. You can go ahead and stop sharing.
Rose, we have a question here about how do your clients find you?
That's an excellent question. Thank you. Let me get out of this. Sorry. So the majority of the clients come to us, over 90% are referred to us from other organizations, community-based organizations, social service agencies, law enforcement agencies that know about the work that we do and know about the rights of survivors. So typically what we do is all our trainings are free. And so we provide trainings to community-based orgs. And then what we've seen is an actual increase in referrals from a particular organization or a jurisdiction once we've done the training. Once people understand that survivors have rights and there's a reason to get them connected to a free attorney, we do see the uptick in the referrals at that point. A great question. Thank you.
And I just wanted to say that Anne put in the link to Justice at Last in the chat so that you can find more information there. Another question is, what are your biggest challenges? What are the biggest challenges your organization faces?
So there's I think that's a great question. I think for any nonprofit, in particular in the Bay Area, one of the biggest challenges we deal with on a regular basis is funding or lack thereof. I think there's grants, government grants and funding, in particular for survivors of sex trafficking. But as you see, the majority of our clients that we're serving end up being labor trafficked. So there sometimes is this disconnect with the focus of the grant. Government grants also tend to be reimbursed based, so you have to have funding ahead of time. But aside from that, and that's not unique to Justice at Last, I think that's typical of any nonprofit, the challenges with fundraising or aspects of it. I think the other challenge that we see, in particular in the courtroom for our clients, is the misconception or misunderstanding that because you are an adult and you can articulate and choose not to, or you're not a typical, I don't want to say typical, but you're not crying on the witness stand, you're you're coming to court and you're testifying about what happened. What we do see within the courtroom, and it's not just the stakeholders within the court, it's the jury generally, not understanding or recognizing that trauma is different for all individuals, and some people might not want to either testify about the victimhood, that what's happened to them, and so they might either flee and not report what's happened or come to court, or if they do and they are not crying on the stand, that doesn't necessarily equate with them not being a victim or that they're not being truthful. So that has been what we saw that in particular in San Mateo County. There was a recent prosecution that finished in 2022. The court has, the case has since been on appeal in 2023, where all three of the defendants were found guilty of human trafficking. There were numerous victims. There were over 100 victims, but the court only identified a total of 18 victims in the matter. And having conversations with the jury after the fact, learning that a lot of the individuals were not identified because they were able to articulate what had happened to them, and they didn't really appear to be what we would assume a victim who's going to cry on the stand, that therefore they were not believable. And so that goes to the fault of the prosecution or not being able to help educate the jury generally. But it's also, again, a reason why I love being here, an opportunity to share that trauma impacts everybody differently. And so some folks may not be showing that they're hurting inside, that they actually were a victim. It's hard to come forward and admit that you've been trafficked, whether sex or labor trafficked by somebody. There's a lot of shame involved, and there's a lot of other issues for victims not wanting to come forward. So that's a frustration. How do we get over that generally? I think that's one of our biggest challenges.
We have a question. How do you handle victims who don't speak English?
So we've got our staff primarily. We have Spanish speaking staff. We have staff speaking Korean, Mandarin, and Tagalog. And then what we also have a language line, which we can access. Language lines are never ideal. So we're always looking for individuals to do interpretation, whether in person or virtual. But right now, I think that is the main reliance that we have is the language line, which is a translatable and interpreted. It's over 100. I don't remember the exact number, but it's over 100 languages. But ideally, we have staff that's representative of the clients that we're representing. So there are challenges at times where we don't have every language spoken by staff.
I just wanted to interject here. There's a tagline. Well, I shouldn't say it's a tagline. It's been said that every 30 seconds, there's another victim of human trafficking prevalent across the globe. So you talked about the reality that the victim most often knows their trafficker, that they've been groomed. When they
Yeah.
when they become a survivor and they're outside of the human trafficking circle, you have client advocacy. How long do you work with them? I mean, I'm sure you see them in and out for various times because, as you said, they're individuals, and though you want to respect their rights to privacy and
Right.
needs. So,
Yeah. No, that's an excellent question, Nancy. And I think it's something that most people might not really understand. Again, the focus might be, oh, somebody's rescued, so they're fine, right? Let's move on to the next. Let's not focus on, but there's so many challenges and hurdles to the individual. Maybe they've been served a subpoena and they have to testify. And then maybe they don't want to testify. And in the meantime, they don't have housing and they're not employed, so they can't feed their children. So there's all these other legal issues. Or non-legal issues, but sustainability. Like if your basic needs are not being met, you're not going to care that you have to go testify in court. You're going to want to feed your children. That'll be your focus. So there's not a real timeline. For us, we provide legal services. They don't have to be directly connected to the trafficking situation. So we've had clients that maybe were trafficked 20 years ago, and now they're in an unhealthy relationship and they want to get a divorce from their spouse. Maybe there's, domestic violence, whatever, for whatever reason. And now what they're finding and what they're tackling is trying to get custody of their children. And the court's bringing up, well, you used to be a prostitute. You're an unfit parent. So we'll represent that individual, even though their trafficking occurred several years prior. And this family case that they're dealing with right now with custody and the dissolution of marriage has nothing specifically to do with the trafficking. So there's that door that's open. The other one is that, over the course of time. So an immigration case could take years. Once upon a time, somebody filing a T visa could get their application processed and get results and status within a year. Now it's taking in excess of 2 years. And so what happens over that course? So we continue to support the individual. If they have other legal needs that might pop up, we'll address them. We're always letting the client determine what is the priority for them. But we're also providing that case management support system because again, maybe they were employed, but then during the pandemic, many of our clients, because the majority of the work they were doing was for minimum wage jobs. And, as we know, a lot of the retail markets shut down. There were many individuals that were laid off. And so we continue to support them, even though their case was still pending and again, could be several years. So there's not a real time limit per se. And even that, so if we were successful with working with an individual and they got their T visa and 3 years later, they have a legal issue, the door's open. They can always come back to us. They don't need to reshare what it was that happened to them in the prior. As long as we've identified them as a victim of human trafficking, we can turn around and go ahead and represent them. The caveat is that for when we get referrals, individuals do have to meet the legal definition of being trafficked unless they're a minor. So if they're a minor, whether there were sex, or labor trafficking involved, we don't need that to represent the minor. We're not asking very specific details about the facts of that case. We're just trying to fulfill whatever legal need that they might have as a minor. But for adults, we have to go through the process in our intake and determine, do they meet the legal definition of being trafficked?
We have a question. How does the situation here in the Bay Area differ from other parts of the state?
So that's really good. So we're here in the Bay Area practicing law primarily in the Bay. We definitely have clients that have been trafficked throughout the state of California. So then we tend to work with pro bono law firms that might have multiple offices throughout the state of California. But we can get even small, look at it even closer. So how does it differ from county to county as opposed throughout the state? So it's harder for me to say what's going on in Los Angeles County because I'm not there, or Southern California, or even in Central California, or Central Valley, but I am familiar with the Bay Area. And I do know that between Alameda County and San Francisco County and San Mateo County and Contra Costa, the trafficking does look different. And so I think that's something that we need to really consider and think of. In Alameda County, I think at any given time during the day, you could go down International Boulevard right now in Oakland, and you will see children scantily dressed being sold for sex on the street any time of the day. That is not the same instance in necessarily Santa Clara County or San Francisco. That trafficking of children in particular might look a little bit different. It might be more virtual, or it might not be that blatant where it's any time of the day. What we also know about Alameda County in particular is that the majority of those purchasing sex are coming from outside of Alameda County. So you'd have to take a look at the individual counties to determine what's going on. And unfortunately, I'm not familiar enough with Marin County. I know that there's an amazing prosecutor in Marin County that's going after sex trafficking cases, but I'm not familiar as much for labor trafficking and what might be going on there. So, but I think it's a great question. And I think when we're looking at it, we need to take that lens of not making this assumption that just because something's happening in San Francisco, that it's happening necessarily everywhere. But what we do see generally for the entire Bay is an increase of children who are being forced in drug criminality. And we're seeing multiple cases come up in San Francisco County in particular, where the children are being deported and or being prosecuted as adults, or young adults are being deported as well when there's that forced criminality aspect. We're seeing that more than any other county in terms of prosecutions.
Just in general, for human trafficking, the prevalence of it, California is a hotspot in the nation, as is Florida, Texas,
Absolutely.
New York. And I guess here, why here in the Bay Area? We have easy access for moving victims back and forth across the bridges. There's money here. You know, it's a wealthy community, wealthy area. Sacramento is
Absolutely.
also,
And then we've got wealthy. Yeah.
sorry,
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say Sacramento is also
Oh, no, I was
a
going to say,
high frequency area.
yeah.
Do we have any other questions? I think we've done it then, Rose. Thank you.
Thank you all for taking the
Thank
time to listen and ask questions and be engaged. I'm really grateful to you and for the work that you do. I feel privileged to be able to sit in before this training started to hear all the work that you're doing to help create awareness. And I'm just excited about the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for the opportunity
wanted to
today.
say thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Nancy,
Thanks.
this is Kevin. I did have one question, and I think this session is probably answers part of this question. But how can the league be supportive for the work that you and your organization do?
Thank you, Kevin, for that question. I'm really grateful. I know that there's already an interest in doing anti-trafficking work. I'd welcome the opportunity to partner with all of you just in helping create awareness, since you're already so connected with the community, to maybe we partner and do another awareness training for the public or somehow like that. I would welcome that. I mentioned to Nancy before we actually started the training that we collect our data by county, and we don't have any Marin County data. And so what does that mean? It most certainly doesn't mean there's no trafficking going on in Marin. We know that there is, but that justice at last is not connected enough to the key stakeholders in Marin County to help collaborate to create awareness, and then just to let folks know that it's really important for survivors of trafficking when they're no longer in the trafficking situation to get access to a free attorney. It doesn't have to be Justice at Last. It can be any organization that provides legal services that has that level of expertise and understanding trafficking needs. And so I appreciate the question, and I welcome the opportunity to brainstorm and figure out how we could partner in the future.
Definitely
Great.
do that. I'm sorry, I wanted to say that Regina also has her hand raised. So Regina, did you want to ask a question?
I just wanted to ask, it might be more directed to you, Nancy. There's something called the Marin County Coalition to End Human Trafficking. And I see Seroptimist is listed as one of the organizations, and I wonder what kind of coordination there is with this very deep organization. It looks like we've tried as a county to consolidate a lot of the partners. So I wonder what kind of coordination there is with that.
Yes, the League is actually a member of the Marine Coalition to End Human Trafficking, as well as the San Francisco Collaborative to End Human Trafficking. Human trafficking is one of the main focuses of the League nationally, but as Rose was mentioning before about the rescue, that film about the rescue, the League approaches it by demand. They believe that if we reduce demand, that will help in the increase in human trafficking. And it's a different approach. It's probably an approach that we as individuals could better handle, the demand part, as opposed to the rescue part. But Rose, we can have speak at the Marine Coalition to Human Trafficking and Human Trafficking. But if you're interested in doing more with the human trafficking issues, you can join the Justice Committee, because that is one of our focuses. And then you can also be our rep or one of our liaisons with the Marin County Coalition. So you can just drop me a line.
Excellent.
Do we have any other questions here? I think we have it, Anne. Rose, Anne put in the link to the Justice at Last again, but we will definitely be talking about doing some kind of training in the future.
Well, thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Nancy,
Thank
for
you,
putting
Nancy.
for putting this program together. And thank you, Rose, for spending time with us this afternoon. I think a lot of the information you presented is new to us. And I want to thank you for making the time to help educate us. Before
My
we end the meeting, I found my copy of the land acknowledgement, and I just wanted to spend a few minutes, or it should take a minute to read it. So the League of Women Voters of Marin County lives and meets on the ancestral traditional lands of the Coast Miwok people. We acknowledge and honor the Coast Miwok Nation and are grateful for the present day community of the federally recognized tribe, the Federated Indians of the Great and Rancheria, comprised of direct descendants of the Coast Miwok. We also acknowledge other contemporary indigenous groups who live and work in Marin. So thank you. With that, I want to thank people for attending the meeting today and remind people that our next meeting will be Monday, February 5th, in which we'll talk about program planning for 2024.